One of the common complaints I'll see about Wayland is it's 14, 15 years old, whatever it is right now, and it's still not ready for daily use, which, if you've used it in the past 6 months to a year, is fairly debatable unto itself. But I think a lot of people forget just how old X11 actually is. It's been around since 1984, and its display server implementation, Xorg, which forked directly off of X386, has been around since 1991. It's had many years to mature and develop, and over those years, a lot of new features have been added to make Xorg actually usable. If you go back to the core X11 specification, it is not usable on a modern system. And I don't mean running a 30-year-old piece of software. What I mean is having a display server that doesn't have all of the extensions we've built during the time of Xorg and X386. There were a lot of really weird implicit decisions made back in the early days of X11, which, when expanded out to how X is being used today, just simply do not work. One thing being the range of keyboards that are now in use. When X11 was first being developed at MIT, it was pretty easy to assume things like the keyboard layout being used, the keyboard models being used, the keyboard preferences, and things like this. This led to some implicit design assumptions in the early stages of XLib, limiting what X could possibly support. And then eventually, XKB, the X keyboard extension, came along, and in many cases, it directly replaced some of those old XLib functions, with some of the others being deprecated in favor of new XKB functions. But in the case of the ones that were just replaced, migrating over was a fairly simple thing to do. Now, with this, it brought some crazy new features that you would never expect to be here, like, say, enhanced modifier key support, your shift, control, things like that. Better treatment of keyboard layouts. Better control for keyboard lights, and in weird cases that don't exist today, keyboard bells. I'm happy they don't exist anymore. And new controls, like simulating mouse operations. Crazy. Who would have ever thought that would be a good idea? But that is definitely not all that's changed. Nowadays, input devices can have drastically more buttons. Now, in the case of a keyboard, it's mostly the same. You might have some extra, weird buttons up here for macros or stuff, but usually that's not handled by X anyway, so it doesn't matter. But then you have, an MMO mouse, which is just a weird concept. It's basically a keyboard strapped to the side of your mouse. Now, tons of extensions were proposed and tried, but the one that eventually won out was called X Input. And from its inception up until roughly the time where laptops started getting popular, it stayed pretty much the same. When that happened, and nowadays with X Input 2.2, it supports multi-touch gestures. Now, the multi-touch gestures were added somewhere in the time of Xorg development dying off, so they never really got as much attention as, you would like them to have, but they are there. Also, with the MPX feature, you can have multiple users all running on the exact same instance of the same desktop with their own independent cursors, their own independent keyboards, and their own independent focus, doing things all at the exact same time. Now, how well this is going to work on many desktops, I wouldn't be expecting it to go too well, but the feature is there. Let's move away from our input devices and talk about our output devices, specifically what you're going to see on your screen. Now, when X11 was first being developed, it was going to be used on systems with just a couple of megabytes of RAM. These were vastly inferior to what we see today. Just having a working graphical environment was a massive improvement that had only happened a couple of years earlier. And to get this to actually function, you couldn't do all of the nice things we do today. A lot of corners had to be cut to make things actually work. So when windows were moved, raised, or uncovered, clients received something called an expose event. This would tell them to redraw the application window for the newly visible parts of the window. Now, due to this being done naively without any buffering, this would often cause flickering because the systems also weren't fast at doing that redraw. So every application had to be prepared to efficiently redraw any portion of its window at any point in time. And this was definitely a problem, but it worked without wasting extra RAM. But modern computers don't have this problem, even on a really low-end system. Let's say 4 gigabytes of RAM. I'll even give you 2 gigabytes of RAM. That's over 2,000 megabytes. That's a lot of megabytes that you can use for dealing with things and making them run, a little bit nicer. But nowadays, it's completely normal to have, upwards of 16 gigabytes of RAM. So now what you can do is fully buffer every pixel off screen, and then with the help of the composite extension, merge them all back together into the frame buffer being drawn on your screen. Now, the fun thing about composite is it also brings along support for compositing managers. This is what is commonly just called a compositor, allowing you to have fun special effects like transparency, blur, drop shadows, rounded corners, and things like this. But compositing is not in use in every single setup. Sometimes there are compatibility issues with certain other X features, sometimes users just don't want it. So expose events still need to be supported, but with the modern hardware we have nowadays, the redraw overhead is basically negligible. Maybe you'll have a bit of screen tearing, but that's about as far as it goes. Something else that's changed on modern systems is how we use our monitors. So nowadays, it's pretty common to have 2 monitors, or to have a laptop and an external monitor. Or maybe, you like projectors. You want to just plug in a projector and then put something on the projector. All of these totally normal use cases. But in the early days of X, each of your X screens was a single mapping from a screen to a monitor, and if you added in additional screens, those were all their own individual mappings. The problem with this is if you had an application on one screen, works fine. You couldn't drag it to another screen. This was initially solved with Xinorama, basically taking all of those individual X screens and then merging them into one big X screen. So now you can just drag things where you go, because to X it thinks it's just one big monitor. This includes having vertical monitors or upside down monitors, whatever you want to do. X is just like, it's just a monitor. I don't really care how it got like this. I just see it as what it is. And that solves one of the big problems. The second big problem was hot plugging. So traditionally, if you started up your X server, that's what you had. If you plugged a new monitor in, if you plugged a projector in, you plugged anything else that you want to display your X server on, it wouldn't work. The only way to get it to actually load on that is to shut down the X server, add the monitor into your configuration, and then start back up again. This was very inconvenient, especially in cases of, say, a laptop. So what needed to be done is creating a method to configure X's monitor configuration on the fly. This led to XR&R, or XRander. Now the full name is X Resize, Rotate, and Reflect extension. Now you might notice there's an additional R in there. Initially, Reflect wasn't a part of the feature set, and it got called XRander before that was added. The name kind of stuck, and they couldn't change it. So yes, while Xorg might do everything you need it to do today, that wasn't always the case. There was a time where it was incredibly inconvenient to use. And Wayland has been going through that as well. It's been having new extensions made, new protocols made, that makes it more and more convenient to use, and it's getting to the point nowadays where it's really hard to justify not actually using it. Now, there are cases like accessibility, totally fair. Network transparency, for the one person who cares, and Nvidia. All of these are legitimate reasons to not use Wayland, but they are not reasons to completely throw it in the trash. They are things that are going to be addressed over time and eventually will likely be better. Now, I want to give credit where credit is due. Most of this information came directly from the Xorg documentation, specifically the XNew Developer's Guide, Modern Extensions to X. This is a horrible name, but it does the job. This includes all of these extensions, along with one that I didn't bother to cover just because I didn't find it really that interesting. But yeah, if you want to go read about X, this is probably the best place to go and do so. Not just this page, but the rest of the X documentation. Many of these changes have been around since sometime in the 90s, so most of this time we've been on Linux, people have been using these extensions, but they were definitely not there at the start, as many people back then just didn't realize that some of these things would actually be necessary. And the same can be said about what's happening to Wayland. When it was first being developed, the developers didn't realize all of the cases that would need to be addressed. And then as time continues, more of these cases are being brought up, more of these issues are being addressed, and we are slowly getting a better and better system that's dealing with a lot of these problems. We realize the initial assumptions we made may not have been entirely correct, so hopefully then we can course correct and change or add to the implementation to better address these cases. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Do you use X? Did you know about some of these things not existing in the early days? Are you a Wayland developer that used to be an X developer that maybe worked on some of this? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go and like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one over these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribe, Sully, Bearapay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and X is dead.
Daytime better come correct. Ain't playing at your best, then you will get left. If it don't involve money, then I don't accept. If it don't involve money, then I don't accept.